So today, let's begin part 3 of our interpersonal communication discussion. Today we want to tackle the idea surrounding perception and its relation to communication. So we might ask ourselves, first and foremost, what is perception? Perception is the active process. It's an active process, so it's ongoing, of creating meaning. Remember, of course, from the first part of our discussions here, we talked about the fact that meaning is created in people, not necessarily in words. Meaning is created in people and not in words. So, perception, the active process of creating meaning, how? By selecting, organizing, and interpreting people, objects, events, situations, and other phenomena. So somehow, as we go through our lives, our daily lives, and start looking around at things, we're creating meaning for ourselves and trying to interpret what all of this means that happens around us and what kind of meaning does it indeed have. Because remember, of course, meaning is created in people, not in words, not in objects, and meaning, things themselves. For example, a pen doesn't have meaning in and of itself. But if this were, for example, a gold pen that were given to me upon my retirement from a position that I've had for 50 years, the meaning might be there because it's very symbolic of the time and the dedication that was put in. Okay, so perception, the active process of creating meaning by selecting, organizing, and interpreting people, objects, events, situations, and other phenomena. So let's break that down a little bit, because I think that's what's important here as we start looking at this part of the discussion. The first part of perception is selection. We select to attend to certain stimuli based on a number of factors. We select to attend based on a number of factors. The first might be the qualities of the phenomena itself. Now, before we start talking about those qualities, let's take a step back and talk about expectancy. If I expect something to occur because I've become very accustomed to it and I see it happening all the time, I don't necessarily notice it and all the fine details about it. For example, what color shirt were you wearing 5 days ago? If you can't tell me, and you're giving me that look that says you don't even remember, how would you expect someone else in the class, for example, to remember what you were wearing 5 class periods 5 days ago? Exactly. And so the fact is, we expected you to wear a shirt. And so when I come into the classroom, I notice, for example, maybe just unconsciously, that everybody is wearing clothes that fit the situation and the circumstances. So my expectancy is met. And if my expectancy is met, then quite frankly, what happens is I don't necessarily remember and I have to interpret this. I'm going to immediately interpret this is what is to be expected, this is normal, and I'm not going to go, aha! So there are certain things that when we see them, we expect them within the environment and the social context we are in. For example, people sitting at desks, all facing the same way. Looking at the board in the front of a room. In school, this is expected and may largely go not consciously recognized and remember later, like the shirt color. However, if the qualities of the phenomena are outside the expectations, for example, those desks all set up in the parking lot, for example, or various members of the class choose to come to school without wearing a shirt entirely, we notice things that are larger, more intense, unusual, or I might say outside the range of our expectancy. So when we talk about selection and the selection process and the selection part of perception, we're specifically referring to and talking about the idea that the qualities of the phenomena are within expectations and perhaps they go unconsciously recognized, but to draw it up to our real conscious recognition, perhaps they need to be more intense, they need to be larger, much smaller, something unusual. Okay. I might wind up looking at selection through self-indication. Telling myself, for example, that I need to pay attention to and that I need to notice something. Especially something I'm particularly looking for. Like when I'm studying, for example. I'm looking for a specific material in an attempt to increase my understanding. Okay, so self-indication. The qualities might be somewhat unusual, or there might be self-indication. I might have a specific motive that would allow me to start paying attention and selecting certain things. Let's assume for a moment that I am single and I am currently looking for someone that might be considered a mate or a date or someone to hang out with, maybe someone of the opposite sex, and as such, what might I start recognizing whether or not someone's wearing a wedding ring, for example, in this particular society. Or I might be hungry. And if I'm really hungry, I'm going to notice much more clearly the smell of food or the restaurants that are actually out and about. Or there might be something about the culture in which we are currently in that requires us to pay attention or that kind of motivates us to pay attention. For example, in some cultures, the elderly are respected highly. And when they are regarded so highly, if they speak or if they're there, they're paid attention to. They're recognized. In some cultures, it might be celebrity. It might be sports heroes. It might be the rich. It might be a politician. It might be something that causes us within this culture that we recognize, we pay attention, and we're selecting, for example. Okay. That's selection. So we notice something. Now what? How do we make sense of it? We apply what we might call constructivism to make sense of what we notice. And this is the organization process. Selection, organization, interpretation. The process of perception. We've talked about selection and what causes us to select to pay attention to certain things. Now let's talk about organization. When I've selected something, I need to organize it. And in this organization process, we're going to call constructivism. We organize and we interpret experience by applying cognitive structures called schemata, or schemata. There are 4 types of schemata or schemata that we want to pay attention to here. When I recognize and I start selecting and paying attention to certain things, okay, those 4 things are going to help me organize or categorize the phenomena and the people and the events and the things that happen around me into these items. The first is prototype. A prototype defines the clearest or most representative examples of some category. For example, if a Cadillac is the car of luxury, the greatest example of a car of luxury we've ever known. And for many years, the Cadillac was. It may not be any longer, but the image still exists. The Cadillac is your prototype of a luxury automobile. So if the prototype, the Cadillac, helps you decide what else fits in that particular category, luxury car, then the Cadillac is your prototype. So if I have someone in particular who I think exemplifies the best example of a best friend that I could ever see, that I could ever have, I'm going to use every other friend that I run into, and I'm going to compare those people to the one example of my best friend that I can. And if they measure up, then what's going to happen is I now have another one fit in that category based on comparing it to the prototype, or the clearest and most representative example of the category. Prototypes. The second cognitive schemata is the personal construct. A personal construct is a mental yardstick. You know, we used to measure a person or a situation, interesting enough, along a bipolar measurement. Think about this for a moment. In the English language, we have an awful lot of descriptor words, of adjectives, that we might use to describe someone who is very attractive. Pretty, beautiful, gorgeous. The list can go on the one extreme. Very attractive. What about the other side of that extreme? Very unattractive. I can come up with all kinds of English language descriptors here as well. So I might have ugly, I might have dog, I might have toad, I might have things that are associated with unattractiveness and hideous and things like this that in some cases are not complimentary, right? But unattractive is a very diplomatic way of saying something that isn't complimentary. Okay. That having been said, I want you to stop and think for a moment. If I can come up with a long list of adjectives for this side of the continuum of attractiveness, and I can come up with a long list of adjectives for this side of the continuum for unattractiveness, how many descriptors can I come up with for right in the middle? Average, moderate, plain. You know, the interesting thing about those words is that those words could almost be described as the middle of many different kinds of continuum. For example, if I was talking about intelligence, I might have very intelligent, genius, smart, pardon me, or other things along this side. On this side I might have stupid, I might have unintelligent, I might have goofy, I might have all kinds of words here as well. But in the middle, average, medium intelligence, plain, normal. Again, these words are not really descriptive and they're not applicable specifically to intelligence. And so when we talk about personal constructs, it's a mental yardstick that is very bipolar. It has a tendency, and we have a tendency of dividing things, and the idea of it's either this or it's that. And rarely do we really start putting people right in the middle. Because when we start putting people at extremes, we are able to organize the world around us into what makes better sense for our own understanding of the world around us. What about a stereotype? I've got a prototype, I've got a personal construct, or personal constructs, and I have stereotypes, number 3. Stereotype. This is a predictive generalization applied to a person or situation. A predictive generalization applied to a person or situation. This is based on a category in which we place someone or something and how that person or thing measures up against the personal constructs we apply. We predict what he, she, or it will do. For example, you're an athlete. As such, I'm going to predict that you may sit in the back of the room. You may not be that involved in course material because not all athletes, if the stereotype that I'm personally holding, which may not apply to everybody's stereotype of an athlete, but mine, just for the sake of hypothetical at this point. So I might look at you and say, okay, so you're going to sit in the back of the room, you're not going to engage because school topics and discussions of intelligence and educated information isn't really your thing. And that puzzled look you're giving me might be apropos, because I might be dead wrong. And it's quite possible that I might be. But it might be that these are the stereotypes that I hold, and I'm looking at you and saying, all right, this must be how you're going to work with. Now, are stereotypes good or bad? Good question. Because think about this for a moment. Every time we start talking about stereotypes in any formal institutional setting, we are often talking about the dangers of stereotyping. Oh, you shouldn't stereotype, we're often told. Oh, you should be very careful of stereotyping. Of course you should. But here's the real truth about it. Stereotyping allows us to navigate society with a little bit more certainty, at least in our own minds, about how the world operates around us. And if we feel, at least, that we are a little more certain about the kinds of things that are happening around us, it makes it a whole lot easier just to get along. Our anxiety and stress levels are lower. So should we stereotype? There's no way of getting around it. We will stereotype. The question is whether we're stereotyping for ethnic origins, political views, whatever it might be. We need to make sure we're keeping an open mind, so when somebody actually proves that they don't fit a stereotype that we might hold exactly, that we have room in our own self-concept to allow them to be and to grow beyond the stereotype. So we have prototype, we have personal construct, we have stereotype, and then finally, in the last cognitive schemata that we're dealing with respect to constructivism, within this whole organization process, is script. Script. A script is a guide to action. Scripts consist of sequences of activities that are expected of us and others in particular situations. They are based on our experiences and observations of interaction in various contexts. Many of our daily activities are governed by scripts, although we're not typically aware of them. We have a script for greeting casual acquaintances on campus. We have a script for interacting with waiters or waitresses at restaurants. We also have scripts perhaps for managing conflict. Talking with our bosses, talking with our peers, talking with our classmates, our friends, our family, interacting with coworkers on the job, or a whole number of things. And this is why communication can be taught successfully to people who come from other cultures and to people for whom English isn't their first language, because they're able to learn a lot of these scripts. You know, I have a friend who has been going to a restaurant for years and interacting with the proprietor of an ethnic restaurant. And the proprietor of the restaurant did not speak English as their primary language. And finally, something in current events was happening and was being put out in the news. And my friend went up to the proprietor and said, "So what do you think about this?" The recent news event. And the proprietor of the restaurant said, "Yes, thank you, how are you?" At which point my friend, after about 3 years of interacting with this proprietor, finally came to the realization that that person's grasp of English wasn't that good. What was going on here? The person had mastered the various scripts that were accomplished, that were appropriate for the restaurant scenario between the restaurant owner, the restaurant cashier, the waiter, waitress, whatever role they might be playing, and the customer within the restaurant. What that meant was, after all this time, when my friend decided that they were going to talk about something that really didn't fit the script at all, the proprietor responded as if they were still working with one of those scripts. But how long did it go before the realization was even made, because they went off script, that that person didn't understand the communication? We have scripts for various circumstances and situations with the people we talk to and how we interact with them. Again, this organization, this constructivism, by dealing with these 4 specific cognitive schemata, we are indeed trying to coordinate the communication and organize the world around us. Because it would be really difficult and cause high levels of anxiety if we were uncertain how everyone was going to act every time we met them. If every time I interacted with you, I didn't know if I was going to get into a fight, a friendly greeting, or other possible alternatives. And so it is with these organizational methods that we begin to say, this is how the world operates within this culture. Perception. So the process, the threefold process that we've been looking at includes selection, organization, and we've talked about those 2. Let's talk about interpretation. Once we select and categorize things that happen in the world around us, we still have to interpret what all of it means and thus assign this meaning. Remember, of course, that meaning lies within people, not within words. Can we, and how do we, assign motives to the actions of others so they make sense to us? Do we assign motives to the actions of others? Of course we do. And in fact, a lot of times when we talk about others' behavior, what we're often doing is discussing what we think, why they did what they did. And so what we do is we often look at that subjective process of explaining perceptions, the way it makes sense to us, and how it normally makes sense to us is usually through 4 different attributions. Those attributions are locus, stability, specificity, and responsibility. Again, those 4 attributions: locus, stability, specificity, and responsibility. So what's an attribution? An attribution is an explanation of why something happened or why someone acts a certain way. And attributions have these 4 dimensions that we do indeed consciously or unconsciously apply to our interpretations. Again, why? So they make sense to us. And a lot of this communication that happens within the whole process of perception happens within ourselves, doesn't it? This is an intrapersonal communication process to make the world, allow the world to make sense to us and our position in it. So locus, the first of these attributions. Locus attributes a person's actions to either internal factors or external factors. So, for example, why are you constantly late for class? Constantly late for work? Constantly late for whatever it might be? Well, the first attribute, the locus, might suggest that this is an internal factor. The person is very lazy and just can't really get themselves motivated to get to wherever they need to be on time. How about an internal factor? I'm sorry, an internal factor, they're lazy. The external factor, maybe they have to wait for someone else to arrive prior to their leaving because they have a child at home and they need to wait on a babysitter. And for some reason, the babysitter only gets out at a certain time, can only get to this person's place of residence by a certain time, and then this puts the person in question behind schedule. Okay. Internal, within themselves. External is something outside of outside of them that causes the issue. All right, that's locus. Locus has to do with internal or external factors. The second is stability. The second attribution is stability. This explains actions as a result of stable factors that won't change over time. You're a very nervous personality. You have a type A personality. And as such, you're quite punctual and you're getting where you need to be all the time. Or unstable factors that will be different at another time. You're late because you suffer from occasional migraine headaches. And you've been having a headache for the last week, and it's caused you to be late and not be able to stay focused on everything on a regular basis throughout this week. Stability has something to do with time. If it's unstable, it's a temporary thing. If it's a stable, it's an enduring thing. Locus, stability. The third one is specificity. Specificity. It explains behavior in terms of whether the behavior has a global implication that applies in almost all situations. In other words, no matter what, that person is a very generous, kind, and loving person, no matter the situation. Or specific implications that only apply in situations or under certain conditions. That person is being kind, for example, only because they know they're being watched. Only because they know they're being watched. They're at grandmother's house and they know grandmother's paying attention to how you are treating the dog. So when we talk about specificity, we're talking about the overall implications from very specific, meaning under certain circumstances, or more broadly speaking, more global speaking, that this is just who you are in your general behavior. Finally, the fourth attribution, when we talk about locus, stability, specificity, the fourth one, responsibility. Do we hold a person responsible for a particular behavior? So in other words, is it within their own control, or is it beyond their control? Is it within their own control, or is it beyond their control? Now, consciously or unconsciously, when we start describing people and their behavior, and we want to attribute motives as to why they did what they did, we are often communicating about these four areas. About these four areas. Locus, stability, specificity, and responsibility. Was it in their control? Was it something, for example, that they are doing because someone's watching them? Is it something that they're late because of a traffic jam? Is it something that they're always that way because it's a personal characteristic of theirs? You can see how when we start trying to attribute motives, these can change depending upon whether or not we are favorable, we like the person to begin with, depending upon whether or not we don't care for the person to begin with, depending upon whether or not, and we can fill in a lot of conditional situations at this point. So when we start looking at all of these four attributions and we start looking at motivations, whether it's our own or someone else's, one of the things that, or two of the things that we have to be very careful of, or what we call the two attributional errors. The first one is the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias. This is where we're casting ourselves in the most positive light with respect to those four attributions. Okay, so if it's something positive, it was obviously within my own control. It was obviously global. It's something I do all the time. It was obviously very stable, part of my enduring personality. And it's probably something that is very internal to me. But if it's something that's negative, how am I going to describe it myself and the situation? I'm going to make it things that are not enduring to me, but can somehow place the blame outside of my control and outside of who I am based on circumstances. So what is the self-serving bias? It's that tendency to attribute our positive actions and successes to stable, global, internal influences under our control. And adversely, to attribute our negative actions and failures to unstable, specific, external influences beyond our control. So basically, I'm taking all the things and saying, everything that's good, I'm responsible for it, was all me. Everything that's bad, somehow it wasn't me, and there were forces that were acting upon me that I didn't have control over. The self-serving bias. So if I'm always taking this view, this is an error, and I'm suggesting that I'm distorting my perception just to make myself always look good. And is that reality? Good question. So why did I get here on time? It's because I planned it that way. I'm a responsible person. Why was I late? Traffic jam. Electrical outage and my alarm clock didn't go off. Okay, that's the self-serving bias. That's the first of the attributional errors that we want to discuss today. The second of the attributional errors that we want to discuss today, I'm going to call the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error. This is overestimating the internal causes of others' behavior and underestimating the external causes. Let me say that again. Overestimating the internal causes of others' behavior. In other words, when I'm looking at somebody and I'm saying, you're late, I'm overestimating the internal causes, meaning you are really lazy, for example. I'm overestimating things that are specific to you and your internal issues. And I'm underestimating the external causes. That traffic jam really wasn't so bad. You're using that as an excuse. You can see where I might be trying to put greater emphasis on another's internal issues and saying, this is all you. And that's where the problem is. And not recognizing there may really be external factors involved. And don't we sometimes do this when we're in conflict with someone? And we're actually trying to describe to someone else why you did what you did that hurt me so much. Well, you did it because you're mean, of course. You just got a mean streak a mile long. And you wouldn't even come to the meeting when we were supposed to be at the meeting on time. And because you showed up late, you were trying to insult me. Could it be that it was simply a traffic jam, like you said? Yeah. So the fundamental attribution error. I'm overestimating the internal causes of others' behavior and underestimating external causes. All right. So there you go with the basic process of perception. Selection, organization, interpretation. That's perception. What are the influences? What things and factors could influence perception? What things and factors could influence perception? The first might be physiology. I've got to pull things in through my senses, don't I? My eyes, if my eyes have a problem, my ears have a problem, my touch has a problem. If there's something wrong or not, my physiology isn't as keen as it could be, there might be an influence on my perception. What if, for example, we take spicy foods. You might find it really annoying and just really kind of irritating because your taste buds are overly sensitive. I might find it very flavorful and enjoyable. Big difference. Physiology. More like, and let's talk about temporary physiology. If I'm tired, fatigued, stressed, sick, I might perceive things more negatively. Perceive things more negatively. I'm a morning person. I'm more apt to be positive and receptive to things in the morning. 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, my brain's already saying it's time to go to bed. It's time for your rest cycle. It's time to sleep. And you're not going to focus and you're not going to concentrate. And as such, you might take things a little bit more negatively. What about people with medical conditions, drugs, chronic pain? These would have an effect on how we perceive. Expectations would also have, remember we talked about expectancies? Expectations also have influence on positive or negative perceptions, etc., right? Because if, for example, I'm going to meet your good friend, I'm going to meet your mom, maybe, meet a relative, meet somebody who's related to you, and you've set me up with all these expectations, think, oh, this person is the greatest person in the world, they are overly friendly, they're very happy people, and so what am I expecting? I'm expecting to meet a happy person, and as such, when I go to meet that person, the slightest indication that might give me the idea that they are happy is going to reinforce my expectations, and I'm going to go ahead and receive that person very positively. The reverse can also be true. Oh, you got to be careful when you meet that person. Why? Because when you meet that person, you're going to find that they are very negative people. You're going to find that they are very glum. They're very sorry-looking people. They're very hard to get along with. They're very cranky. They're whatever it might be. And when I meet those people, I may have met the exact same person as before, but I'm now set up to be expecting certain negative behaviors, and so these are the things that I've selected to attend to as a result of that expectation that we set up together. So expectations would certainly also influence perception. Age influences perception. Think about that for a minute. Do you see things the same way today as when you were 7 years old? Of course not. Of course not. Older people versus younger people have much more experience, and they can compare their perceptions to a library of experiences that they already have, and are thus able to have more clear interpretations because they've got greater, we hope, greater understanding that comes with age and hence experience. Culture also can affect perception. Beliefs. Well, I mean, culture is what? Beliefs, understandings, practices, and ways to interpret experience that are shared by a group of people. If somebody comes into the room screaming and yelling about something, we might get scared because we're thinking they're going to attack us, or that they're absolutely crazy or have a mental problem of some kind. And yet, it might be that it was an expectant father who just found out that his wife gave birth to a brand new, healthy baby child. And they can't contain their joy. Completely different interpretation based on cultural expectations. We also have what we call social location, and this is akin, very similar to standpoint. The knowledge and perspective shaped by the material, symbolic, and social conditions common to members of a social group. Do women see things differently than minority males in a culture? Sure they do. Do children see things differently than the dominant male cultural member? Sure they do. How about the elderly? Of course they do. And so, depending upon where the person is in their standpoint, gender, how about roles, professions? Are they a doctor, a teacher, a student, a customer? their standpoint within the culture itself can influence the perception of what they're able to select, organize, and interpret. Cognitive abilities as well will influence perception. For example, how elaborate do we think about the perception process of selecting, organizing, interpreting, etc.? See, one of the interesting things about people who are more akin to science, who enjoy science, have spent some time in biology classes and have spent a lot of time looking at life through organizational classifications. Genus, phylum, class, species, etc., etc. I don't know them in order, and I don't expect to know them in order. I'm not a scientist in that regard. I'm not a biologist. And as such, people who are and who can classify life, species, etc., under those categorizations have a greater set of classifying people and organisms than the common person. Their cognitive complexity is much greater than mine, or at least much greater in detail in that arena. So how many bipolar constructs, personal constructs do we have? How elaborate has our cognitive complexity given us to thinking about the organization of phenomena around us? Can that affect our perception? The more we've thought about it and how it works, sure it can. Am I perhaps affecting how you're going to perceive things after you are finished with this particular discussion? It's possible. It's possible. And person-centeredness can also influence our perception. Can we see others as unique individuals? You know, in a former discussion, we talked about the I-thou relationship. When I recognize people that I have significant relationships with as unique human beings. When I see them as unique human beings, can I be empathetic with them and understand their perspective on what they view and perceive? If the answer to that question is yes, then I can actually approach a person-centeredness perspective on perception. Will that affect how I view through your eyes, affect my ability to perceive things? It will, of course. A final influence on our perception is ourselves. Consider how differently people with the 4 attachment styles that we discussed in a previous discussion in part 2 would perceive and approach close relationships. People with secure attachment styles assume that they are lovable and that others are trustworthy. Remember, we talked about how people who have had secure attachment styles from the time that they were born through their infancy will view as adults positive outlooks on themselves and positive outlooks at others. Thus, they tend to perceive others and relationships in positive ways. In contrast, people with fearful attachment styles perceive themselves as unlovable and others as not loving. Consequently, they may perceive relationships as dangerous and potentially harmful. The dismissive attachment style inclines people to perceive themselves positively, others negatively, and close relationships as undesirable. And people who have anxious, ambivalent attachment styles often are preoccupied with relationships and perceive others in unpredictable ways. So even ourselves and our own self-concept that we discussed from a previous discussion can affect how we today perceive anything else. People, events, phenomena, etc. For instance, you might think that people who are outgoing are also friendly, confident, and fun. Now think about that for a moment. People who are outgoing, we sometimes group or clump together friendly, confident, and fun characteristics to them. What am I doing? I'm engaging in what is known as the implicit personality theory. implicit personality theory. The implicit personality theory is a collection of unspoken, sometimes unconscious assumptions about how various qualities fit together in human personalities. Unspoken, sometimes unconscious qualities that go together. When I see one, I somehow attribute the other ones in a clump, if you will, in a grouping to that same individual. You might think that people who are outgoing, I'll repeat this again, are also friendly, confident, and fun. The assumption that outgoing people are friendly, confident, and fun reflects your specific and individual implicit personality theory of the qualities that accompany outgoingness. And that can happen with a number of other qualities as well. When I see somebody who displays this particular quality, I might group other qualities of alternative groupings also to an individual. And we need to be conscious that we're doing this. Recognizing that we're involved in these sort of perceptive, organizational tricks, if you will, to help our own minds make sense of the world will certainly put us on a much greater understanding of that world around us. Because as we're looking at trying to figure out how to improve our own perception and our own communication skills relative to perception, a couple of things need to be paid attention to. The first is that we should recognize that all perceptions are partial and subjective. Can we know everything? No. Based on everything we just talked about, it's not possible for us to know it all. So we should recognize that we are very subjective, based on our own perceptions and interpretations, and partial. We don't see it from every point of view. Thus, we cannot have complete interpretations. We should avoid mind reading. What is mind reading? Mind reading is assuming that we understand what another person thinks and how another person perceives something. This is often a harmful practice because mind reading denies the other person the chance to explain their own thoughts or feelings because somehow we just believe we know what they are. We should avoid mind reading. Because perceptions are subjective and partial, and because mind reading is an ineffective way to figure out what others think, we do indeed need to practice checking our perceptions with others. Practice checking our perceptions with others. We should also distinguish between facts and inferences so that we're able to make sure that we're just not relying on quick attributions that we discussed earlier in this discussion. Can I tell the difference between a fact and an inference? I can if I stop and think what is fact and what is inference and make sure I'm distinguishing between the two. A fact is based on observation. You were late for class. An inference involves an interpretation that goes beyond the facts. You are lazy. How could I possibly know that? I'm inferring it by the fact that they were late for class. Could that inference be wrong? It could be dead wrong. Absolutely wrong. And we need to be careful of that. We need to guard against the self-serving bias, recognize maybe when we are trying to make ourselves look best, and recognize that we might also be needing to guard against the fundamental attribution error. Are we really being fair when we engage in either of those? No, we're not. And in fact, we're practicing a very distorted process of perception. And you know, the last I think we need to pay attention to is that we need to monitor labels that person is lazy. I've clung to the inference. I've attached a label. And we need to monitor those labels to make sure that we are not clinging to the label and ignoring the facts. And so that we don't wind up making the labels interfering with the phenomena that is occurring. The more we label, the more abstract we get from reality, and thus the greater the abstraction, the more we are removed from reality. So eventually, for example, we take this example and continue this example, I'm referring to this person as the lazy one. It may have no bearing in truth whatsoever. And at this point, will say a lot more about me and my distorted perception process, and potentially damage you for making constant use of a label that doesn't really apply. So we need to monitor labels. Perception and communication. Today's discussion was all about trying to understand how perception affects our communication, and how, quite frankly, our communication affects ours and others' perceptions. If we can get a good handle on that, then we've done a really decent job in coming to a good understanding of what we're trying to do with today's work.